The following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
Thank you, Tally Olson. I'm Ralph Tycho with the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network, and it is my privilege to introduce another episode of The Packaged Tourist, hosted by the Packaged Tourist in the Magical Mystery Tour called Life, Matthew DiBiase, who tonight will be interviewing baseball historians Bob LeMoine and Bill Nowlin on their newly released book, The Glorious Beaneaters of the 1890s.
Thank you, Ralph. Tonight, ladies and gentlemen, our featured guests are baseball historians Bob LeMoine and Bill Nowlin, who will be discussing their newly released book, The Glorious Beaneaters of the 1890s. Bob LeMoine is a New Hampshire resident and has been a member of the Society of American Baseball Researchers for many years and has written many SABR Project profiles and numerous stories for the SABR Games Project, which chronicles notable baseball games dating back 150 years. In 2016, Bob co-edited with Bill Nowlin the book Boston's First Nine, the 1871 to 1875 Boston Red Stockings. Bill Nowlin has been a lifelong Boston Red Sox fan and was one of the first fans to mob pitcher Jim Lonborg when he pitched the final out of the game that clinched the 1967 American League pennant for the Red Sox. Bill was elected vice president of SABR in 2004 and served 5 terms in that capacity before becoming director in 2016. Bill has authored many works devoted to Red Sox players or the Red Sox franchise as a whole. Bob, how did this book project, which is devoted to the Boston Beaneaters of the 1890s, come about?
Well, as you mentioned, Bill and I worked on the book for the 1871 to 75 Boston Red Stockings, and that kind of came about as I was doing some stuff for the Games Project, and I thought, when was the first actual professional game in Boston? And so I got back into 1871 and all those kinds of things, and I said to Bill, I said, this is really interesting. We should write a book on this. And Bill, having the forethought, said, well, why don't you go ahead and write it, and I'll help you. And so that kind of came up with that book for the Red Stockings. And so once we had completed that, Bill actually got the idea from, and probably Bill can talk some on this, Bill got the idea from somebody about this idea doing 19th century Boston stuff as well with the Beaneaters.
I thought the idea for the Beaneaters came from you, Bob. It shows you how good a memory I have.
Yeah, I thought you said it was somebody related to Peter Gammons that gave you the idea.
It could well be. I always liked the name the Beaneaters. Yeah,
we had thrown around some different ideas of what we would do next, and we had thought about just a whole bunch of different ideas, and then somehow this idea came up, and we kind of ran with it.
I'm glad that you guys wrote that book because based on my own personal baseball research, even though I'm not a member of SABR, I've always been a baseball history enthusiast, and I've always had a fascination with 19th century baseball. It's ironic because the Beaneaters, isn't it true they were the greatest team of the 1890s? Is that true in terms of their record and what they accomplished?
Well, you have a lot of people think back to the old Baltimore Orioles, and they were a great team too. They had John McGraw, and they had some great players, and they won 3 pennants in that era. But a lot of people don't realize Boston won 5, and on either end of the era, in 1890 and 1899, Brooklyn won a couple of pennants. So you got 3 teams that won all the pennants of that decade. And so Boston, won 3 in a row, and then Baltimore took over, and then Boston came back at the end of the decade and won the final 2. So it was quite and I think I said this in the introduction. We think about the Red Sox of 04, 07, 13, but it was actually nothing compared to what this team was in the 1890s.
If you win 5 out of 10 years, you're doing pretty good.
Yeah, I'd say so.
Yes. Now, Bill, Bob, technically you're not the only two authors of this work. Actually, you were the co-editors, and actually you got a lot of guys. Both of you were able to recruit a lot of guys to contribute chapters on the individual players. I'd like to ask you both, how difficult was it getting the various authors who contributed chapters to this book, to contribute to this book?
Well, first of all, Matt, you said you're not a member of SABR. That is something that's easily rectified. If you ever wanted to join, it's not. We would not exclude you. It's not something you have to pass a test to get into. You just have to be interested in baseball and want to join. And this is a SABR book. It's one of about 70 books that we've done over the last 10 years or so. This book had 50 people that contributed to the book. They're all SABR members, and some of them wrote biographies of the players that were on the team during that decade. Some of them wrote up some of the games that existed, and then there were different people that wrote different essays. One person wrote just how the team came to be known as the Beaneaters. Another one, which was me, wrote about spring training each year during the course of the 1890s. And different people wrote about different subjects. But it was we put out the word that we wanted to do this book. A lot of people within SABR. SABR's got about 5,500 members or so, and we send out the word. And some people were especially interested in 19th century baseball, so they came forward. Some people interested in Boston baseball, they came forward, and in some cases we reached out to people. But it really only took a matter of days to get the list of people together. Every once in a while somebody, fell out, dropped out for one reason or another, health or something else, and maybe they got a new job, and we'd have to get a pinch hitter or a replacement author. But for the most part, we had a little more than 50 writers and editors that pitched together, and it takes some months, of course, to pull something like this together. Then we have to collect all the photographs. It's just kind of fun. It's a group activity, and as opposed to just sitting by yourself in a room and writing a book, you're engaging with a lot of other people.
So, Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, yeah. I was going to say Bill is really a mover and shaker as far as the book projects are concerned. I get, when I contribute to projects, I'll get his emails, and one of them recently said that a book that we're working on probably won't be coming out until 2021. I mean, we're that far ahead as far as, almost a book a month, basically, is what SABR puts together. So it's really amazing, the work that a lot of people do with these projects.
So in terms of length of time, how long did it take from beginning to end for this book to become a reality in terms of months or years?
It was more or less about a year, partly because it got held up by a couple months because there were other books in the queue ahead of it. But it takes time. We give people the time they need. We try to set a deadline that's maybe 4 or 5 months in the future, so that people aren't stressed out, have time to be able to put these articles together. We go through a process. Typical biography might be about 3,500 words, but somebody has to go and find these people that were born, well over 100 years ago. They played over 100 years ago. And so, we try to tell their life story from what their family conditions were like, where they were born, what their parents did as occupations, how they grew up, if we can tell how they got into baseball, but certainly follow their professional baseball career. And then what did they do after they finished playing baseball right up to the time they die? And then so somebody writes it up. It goes to one editor, who's in this case was me first, to make sure all the elements were together and to try to fit it into the particular style that SABR uses in terms of the way numbers are rendered, that type of stuff. Bob was the fact checker for the book. So after I finished with it, got the author's okay, it went on to Bob, and he checked carefully to see if, somebody said they were right-handed, that in fact they were right-handed, or that the record was 12-7 on the season, and it wasn't really 13-7. Everybody makes mistakes. I've written maybe one article that didn't have a mistake that a fact checker found, and it's a very important part of the process. Then after we were both finished, it goes to a third person, Len Levin, who was a retired newspaper editor, and he really polishes it up.
Wow. Now, Bob, in the book about the Beaneaters, you wrote the chapter on Cozy Dolan. Would you please tell our listeners who was Cozy Dolan and what were his contributions to the Beaneaters in the 1890s?
Well, it's kind of confusing because if you just go and Google Cozy Dolan, you could find a number of things because there was actually two players, if you can believe it, named Cozy Dolan. One was one that played more 1920s, 1930s, I believe. But this guy was born maybe even close to Bill's house in Cambridge, Mass. in 1872, and he was born to a furniture repair guy, and sort of played around in semi-pro teams in the area, getting involved with what was then the New England League, which was just teams all over Fall River, Portland, Maine, New Bedford, Mass, Springfield, and places like that. That's where a lot of professional teams found what we would call minor leagues today. But he was discovered for having a great curveball, good speed on his ball, a good drop ball, and things like that. And so he kind of hung around those, and then it got his chance with Boston in 1895 and became a pitcher, but his arm just kind of blew out, and he became an outfielder. So he was only with the Beaneaters for a brief time, and then came back later in his career. But made himself into a pretty decent hitting outfielder. And then, unfortunately, during spring training in 1907, I believe, he caught typhoid fever, and died during spring training.
Oh, okay. Because I was kind of wondering, because I remember reading as a youth in 1924, there was a Cozy Dolan who was sort of involved in a scandal in 1924 involving a Giants player. That was his name, O'Donnell, got suspended for life by Judge Landis, and Dolan was suspended too. So it's not the same person, not the same guy.
No, this guy, he was gone before then.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay. Now, Bill, you wrote a chapter in this book on a player named Charlie Frisbee. Please tell our listeners about Charlie Frisbee.
Well, I kind of liked his name. That's one of the reasons I picked it. He didn't have a very long career in the major leagues, but he was. I found almost anybody I look up, I find him interesting. Trying to understand somebody else's life. He came from a pretty well-off background. He got around. He got all over the country in the course of playing professional baseball. He was born in Iowa. His father was a doctor. He went to Grinnell College, so he was, pretty well off. Had a good education and so forth, but he obviously liked to play baseball. And this is the day his first club was Portland in the Pacific Coast League in Portland, Oregon. And you think about it, it wasn't like he signed and then took a flight from Iowa out to Portland. There were no airplanes. There were no automobiles to speak of. I mean, basically, he took a train that took a long time to get there. But in the course of his career, he played for his first 4 years were for Portland, Oregon, Quincy, Illinois, Kansas City, and then he came to Boston. He hit over 300 in all four cities. His best year was probably 1899, the 1 year that he played with the Beaneaters. But he only got into 42 games. He spent half the year, or a little more than half the year, in Worcester, which was not a minor league team in the Eastern League, and he led the league in hitting that year for Worcester. But he did well for Boston. During those 42 games, he hit 329. The team average was 287, so he was distinctly better than the average player on the team. But you think he would have come back the next year, but he got caught up in some contractual problems. It was just the players these days can enter free agency. There was no such thing back then. There was the reserve clause, as it was called, and it was endured for 75 plus years, I think. He was sold to another team. He was from Boston. He just suddenly found himself playing for Grand Rapids. He was just turned over in a deal in Michigan, and then he ended up leaving there and ending up with the New York Giants, who put in a claim. But meanwhile, Grand Rapids was still after him, and so was Cleveland, which was it was still a minor league. It was called the American League. It was the year before the major league, before it became a major league. And he was just caught up in a contractual thing. So he actually played in just a few games, 4 games for the New York Giants, and ended up playing most of the season in Cleveland, not because he wanted to, but because he had no choice. But he ended up playing in Oregon, Illinois, Kansas City, Boston, New York, Ohio. He went to he lost the whole season due to a knee injury in 1901, but by 1903 he was in New Orleans. Then he played a bit for Montreal, for Toledo, for Des Moines, back home in Iowa, Colorado Springs. I mean, this is, as I said, in the day before travel was easy, he was traveling all over the country playing baseball.
You know, you brought up the reserve clause. Didn't I recall correctly, wasn't around this time, or was it the 1880s, that they actually had a hard cap that a player could not make more than $5,000? In other words, no more than that. Was that still in effect in the 1800s, or had they done away with that hard cap at that time?
I couldn't answer. I don't know if you know, Bob.
Because I remember reading something that for a time they had a hard cap. Was it $5,000 or $6,000? That was only reserved for the superstars of the game at that time. I was just kind of curious. I mean, if you don't know, I understand. I'm sorry. You know, I was just kind of curious about that. Yeah.
I'd heard that.
I know Boston had acquired King Kelly in the late 1880s, and that was like a $15,000 purchase, and that was like the most ever paid for a player. So you may be right in that was probably the average of probably the best, because this was far and above anything anybody had ever received.
And of course, King Kelly didn't get the $15,000. It went from one team owner to another.
Well, right.
Yeah. I remember reading that was a puckle, that move. You know, it was like, wow, people were going like shudders, horrors. You know, wow. You know.
Yeah.
Now, Bob, tell us about your chapter on Bill Merritt.
Well, I always seem to have an interest in backup catchers. I don't know why that is, but I seem to do a lot of bios on. They always seem to like make the best managers or the best coaches and things like that. But Bill Merritt had a very short time with the Beaneaters. He kind of bounced around with a few teams, but he started in Lowell, Mass. He was his family came from Ireland, and he played baseball at Holy Cross, and there was a big moment when he was part of a team that actually beat Harvard, and it was the first time that had ever happened in Holy Cross. And so basically they had a big party all night long and carrying players up on their shoulders and things like that, because they just won a game over Harvard. And then he kind of bounced around in the New England League as well. He was in Woonsocket and a couple other places like that. But then he catches on with Louisville, and he was actually called the Woonsocket Wonder when he was in Rhode Island there. He was known for his strong throwing arm and things of that nature. But one interesting thing, when he was in Louisville in 1892, the grandstand had actually burned down the day before when he was there playing a game, and there were still some smoldering ruins of the grandstand, and actually kicked up and created another flame, and so they had to stop the game, there for a little bit. But he mostly was just a backup catcher. He goes, to Columbus, goes to Memphis, and comes to Boston in 1893 and 94. Of course, he's the backup to Charlie Bennett, who was really one of the greatest 19th century catchers until, unfortunately, he slipped and fell off of a train platform and had both legs amputated, or at least one of them. He couldn't walk again. And so he plays some decent ball, got into a few games there in Boston, moves on to Pittsburgh, which interesting. Then he's a backup to Connie Mack. Connie Mack was the starting catcher on Pittsburgh, and everybody thinks of Connie Mack 50-year-long, managerial career in Philadelphia, but he was actually a catcher in the 1890s for Pittsburgh. And so Merritt was backing him up. And so he kind of bounces around with Pittsburgh for a few years, comes back to Boston in 1899. There was a time where he was actually out of baseball in 1898 because Bill talks about Charlie Frisbee getting sold. Well, Merritt was sold to Kansas City of the Western League, but he refused to go. And so he just sat out the entire year. And I have a piece here from the Kansas City newspaper that said, saloon, because he owned a saloon as well in Massachusetts. It said, saloon keeper Billy Merritt says he will stay in Massachusetts and drink his own whiskey before he will play ball in this city for a beggarly $200 a month. So he kind of made a statement, I guess, on that one. Wow. And then around turn of the century, his best days were done, and he kind of still stayed around New England for a long while. He was with Lowell. He was with Manchester, with Nashua, Haverhill, and then stayed around New England for quite a while because in the 1920s, they tried to bring baseball back there to Lowell. The glory days of Lowell baseball were kind of passing by at that point, and he tries to resurrect it. But he was really, really a New England guy through and through, so he was very, very popular and quite an interesting story, I found.
Bob, the Yankees signed Garrett Cole for this coming season. They tried to get him for $200 a month, but he asked for more.
Is it $200 a pitch? Maybe is it $2,000
no.
a pitch?
Not $200 a pitch. Maybe $20,000 a pitch.
Wow. Jeez. Bill, Bob, can you describe for our listeners how did the Beaneaters? What was their style of play in the 1890s? We know today everything is about home runs. It's about, and all that. It's a power game and all that. Games are so long. But what was the Beaneaters' style of play during those glory years of the 1890s? Can you describe it? What was baseball like in the 1890s in terms of styles and tactics?
Bob might be able to answer that better than I. I can tell you the whole team hit 39 home runs as a team. The team leader in 1 year in 1899, Chick Stahl was the team leader with 7. They had a couple guys that drove in over 100 runs. Herman Long, 100, and Hugh Duffy, 102. But so they got the runs in. But in terms of power, that's something that really started with Babe Ruth many years later to really focus on power. They had 2 20-game winners in 1899. Their last season, 27 and 8 was Vic Willis, and Kid Nichols was 21 and lost 19 games. He pitched a lot of games, 42 games, a lot more than starting pitchers do these days.
So are you seeing a lot of hit and run, a lot of base stealing? Is that what we're seeing if we went into a time machine and went back and watched them in action? Is that what we're seeing?
Yeah, you saw a lot of those kinds of things, the hit and run. When you think about it, and a lot of people don't use the phrase today, Baltimore chop, but that was what the Orioles actually developed, where they learned how they could whack the ball down and get a nice bounce on it, and they had enough speedy players that they could reach base oftentimes with that. You're thinking of Wee Willie Keeler and Dirty Jack Doyle. It's just the character names of these people is just really amazing. One of the quotes that we used was from Connie Mack, who remembered that era and said it was a turbulent decade of the so-called roughhouse days in baseball. The Boston Beaneaters were ready for any fray, ever willing to take on the pugnacious Baltimore Orioles and even give them a dose of their own medicine. So it really was this real roughhouse kind of era. And like Bill said, very little power. You had very little use of a pitching staff. You had probably a 2 or 3 person rotation, but often everybody would pitch a full game. It was very rare that you ever brought anybody else in. And a lot of hit and runs, a lot of stolen bases. Of course, one of the people is sliding Billy Hamilton of the era, who was probably one of the greatest base stealers of all time. And so it's really pitching and speed and cheating and fighting and things like that.
The umpires had it tough too. But what you said about the Baltimore chop, I mean, nobody does that today. There's all these metrics on bat speed and, when you hit a ball, how fast it goes out there. These guys were deliberately hitting it into the ground, and they probably don't even know how to measure the hang time that would happen if you banged a ball into the top and it goes up in the air and the fielder has to wait for it to come down before he can throw to first.
Right. And also one thing I failed to mention about Cozy Dolan was the size of the stadiums that were around back then. I mean, Cozy played right field in Cincinnati at the Palace of the Fans. It was 450 feet to right field. And so it was I think it was one of the Boston owners that said they needed motorcycles to get across the outfield because it was so big. And
a lot of the home runs were not hit out of the park; they would just hit past the outfielders.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
And became inside the park home runs. They had to chase these balls down. By the time they chased them down and got it in, the guy under the bases.
Yeah.
That leads to my next question. Okay, Bill, Bob, where exactly did the Boston Beaneaters play their games in the 1890s? What was the name of the ballpark, and where was it located in the city of Boston?
Yeah, the South End grounds. Now, Bill, you can help me with geography better than I can with that. But there were 3 different versions of the South End grounds. Which you're talking. We're right near BU today, correct, Bill?
Yeah. Yes. It was, right. And they went through a few of them because sometimes they would burn down, as you mentioned, with regard to another park.
Yes. Yeah. The original, of course, the original was the 1871 team, and that lasted until I believe the late 1880s, and that was when they built what was really, if you've seen pictures of it, you see huge spires and just a beautiful stadium. Of course, everything was built of wood, and so during the 1894 game between Boston and Baltimore, when I believe it was McGraw and somebody else were getting into a fight, and they look up and the stadium was actually burning down, and they call that today the Roxbury fire, and I forget the numbers now, but it was a lot of devastation throughout the city, and so when they rebuilt that, because the Boston ownership was so cheap, they really didn't have insurance on all that, so they had a much scaled down version. They had a much scaled down version for the third version. Until eventually, but that lasted until Braves Field in 1914 when they started building that.
When I interview authors, I always like to ask them, and I'll start with you, Bob. Who are your personal favorite authors who inspired you and influenced you perhaps influenced your own personal writing style? We'll begin with you, Bob. Who were your favorite authors?
Well, I remember picking up Beyond the Sixth Game by Peter Gammons when I was a kid. And, in later years, it was The Curse of the Bambino by Dan Shaughnessy. Not the greatest of literature, of course, but as a kid, it was like, this was like the inside stuff, no internet back then and things like that. But now I've just got books upon books of things here now that just I can't put things down. It's just There's always something new coming out. The baseball history stuff, John Thorne has written so many great things, 19th century kind of stuff. So, yeah.
Yeah. Now, Bill, who are your personal favorite authors who inspired you or perhaps influenced your own personal writing style?
Well, I don't know where my writing style came from. I don't. It's just sort of, if I have one, it's just. I just try to tell stories. I try to be straightforward about it and just try to tell the story. The books that I read growing up, I tended to focus on Red Sox books for some reason, and Ted Williams was my hero, so I read every book about Ted Williams. There were more than a few. One of the books that impressed me early on was by a guy named, I think I got his name right, Mark Weingardner. It was Prophet of the Sandlots, and it was a story about a scout. And it just caught my attention. I don't know how I ended up with the book, but he told the story of this one scout, that how he went around and in, I guess it must have been the middle part of the 20th century, went around and found ball players. And I thought that was a really interesting approach to take, because I really hadn't thought about scouts much. And there are all these other people involved with the game besides the players, people in the background, and trying to learn more about them or their stories, I have found interesting. I've spent a lot of time talking to umpires over the last 4 or 5 years now. I've got a book about umpires that'll be out in a couple months.
Wow. Bill, Bob, have you gotten real good feedback from baseball, from readers, who about this book? I mean, or baseball historians who are you getting good feedback that they appreciate that this book was written? Are you getting any feedback on that?
Well, it's pretty new. You're one of the first interviews that we've done here.
Okay.
And I don't know. We put out a lot of these books, and I think a lot of the people that write end up working on the next book.
Yeah.
But, it's definitely Saber's happy with the book. The people that all took part in it, I think, have appreciated it, and we're happy for your interest.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you this. I'll give you some feedback right now. Personally, I deeply appreciate that you guys and the other authors involved. Please relay my thanks to all individuals concerned that this book was written, because based on my own personal research, because don't laugh, I know down the road I want to write my own first baseball book. I've got other projects in the fire right now, but I know after 2022 my next book will be about baseball, and I know I want to do some research about the 1890 Beaneaters, and I deeply appreciate this book exists and the depth and texture of the chapters there. I know when I write my own book, because it's going to be about the 50 greatest major league managers, and of course Frank Seeley, who managed the Beaneaters, will be featured. And there's precious little information about him, which is a tragedy, because he was a great manager. I mean, he built the Beaneaters, and also he created the Cubs of the 1900s. I mean, Frank Chance managed it, but Frank Seeley built that Cubs team and made him a powerhouse. He built it. And I deeply appreciate that chapter on them. So I think what you did filled an enormous void, in my opinion, about the history of the Beaneaters, and especially the fact that they were the greatest team of the 1890s. So I can give you some feedback right now. I thank you from the bottom of my heart, you and everyone who collaborated in this project. Thank you.
Well, we'll look forward to your book when you get it together there.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, hopefully, if all comes right, it should come out like April 2026. But it'll be. I'm devising a method for rating the greatest baseball managers of all time, and I know Frank Seeley's going to be up there. I know for a fact, and I really appreciate it. My next to last question is this, Bob. What is your next book project?
Well, I've been working on a number of different things. I'm kind of working on my own book that I try not to tell too many people about because it's taken so long already. So I don't know. I've got another decade in front of me, so I'm hoping I can say with certainty that it'll come out this decade. But I've always been interested in how Babe Ruth came back to Boston for his last year. in 1935, and he was old and worn out, and the Braves were pathetic. And I've always thought, how come nobody's written about that? And so I've been working on that. Of course, I can never seem to say no to any Sabre project. So when one of these books comes up, I wind up contributing, and that takes up some time. And I get recruited a lot for fact checking and things like that. So I've always, like you talk about irons in the fire, I've got stuff going on all the time. But that's kind of what I'm looking at.
Okay, Bill, what is your next book project?
Well, I did mention the umpire's book. It's going to be called Working a Perfect Game. And a perfect game from an umpire's standpoint is not when the pitcher retires 27 consecutive batters. It's when the umpire gets through the game without a controversy and gets just a game where everything works right. There's no disputes. Nobody's upset about any calls, and they get to go in their anonymous world. I kind of joke with an umpire, if I meet an umpire before a game, I say, how many autographs did you sign on the way in? And the answer is, with one umpire exception, Joe West, who's recognizable, most of these guys could walk right next to you, and you would have no idea they were an umpire, unless they were wearing their face mask or something, which is pretty unlikely. So that's going to be an interesting game. I'm working on a lot of different Sabre books, helping to edit them. I really enjoyed that process of working with all these different people. I think our next book out is probably going to be on the Federal League. That should be ready within a month or so for the 2-year league, 1914 and 1915. That was the third major league before it really went out of business.
Fellas, next year will be the 150th anniversary of when the Boston Red Stockings, began operations with the National Association. I was wondering, this time next year, or around spring training next year, would you guys be willing to appear on my show again? We talk about that book, Boston's First Nine, and we'll talk about the Boston Red Stockings. Would you guys be willing to appear on my show again?
Sure, that's fine. Yeah,
I do.
Yeah. I've always had a fascination with 19th century baseball, and especially that period, with the Wright brothers, Harry and George Wright, Spalding, Ross Barnes. I mean, they were a powerhouse. They virtually dominated the National Association in the 1870s, didn't they? I mean, they were the flagship franchise, weren't they?
Oh yes, they were. They had come from the Cincinnati Red Stockings, which, I'm sure you know, they were the undefeated team of 1869, and they were the best team in the world, and so they would just do barnstorming, and they came east in 1870, and halfway through the year they actually lost a game finally. After a year and a half, they lost a game in Brooklyn, and so the fans said, well, we're not interested in this anymore, so nobody cared in Cincinnati anymore. And so George and Harry made connections with somebody back east, and hey, why don't you bring some of your fellows to Boston? And there we go.
Yeah. Well, I'd love to have you guys on again next year. We could talk about that book. I would really love to ask you guys, to quiz you guys about that, because again, I've always been. What I would give? I would wish someone would make a movie about like a team in the 19th century, like the 1897 pennant season. I know Bill James said a great movie could have been made about that, or like the Cincinnati Red Stockings, or the Boston Red Stockings, or even the St. Louis Browns of the 1880s. I wish someone would do that, make a movie about it. I mean, do you ever had the same wish like that?
That'd be interesting.
There's Hollywood ever approached
certainly a lot of baseball movies out there, but I certainly never seen one like that.
Yeah.
I've always thought you could learn a lot from if there was a movie on King Kelly, because that covers a lot of 19th century kind of stuff. If you did a movie on him, you can get a lot of that in there.
Yeah. I mean, Cap Anson, the early White Stockings. I mean, my goodness. I mean, with the Browns, they dominated the 1880s. I mean, I just wish someone would do that. Just how different the game was as opposed to today's game. Just capturing that rural feel, the informality of it, the low salaries, and just how different it was. I wish someone would do that. Well, fellas, I want to thank you very much for appearing on my show, and like I said, hopefully next year we can we talk about the other book, the 1871 to 1875 Boston Red Stockings. I want to thank you both, and you take care. Okay.
Okay.
Thank you, Matt.
Thank you very much, Matt.
It's a pleasure, honor and a pleasure. It's honor and a pleasure. And hey, go Red Sox, eh?
It's going to be quite a season.
That's for sure.
Okay.
They got a manager today, though.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, stay tuned, ladies and gentlemen, for next week's show, where I will be interviewing author Noel Hind on his book, The Final Game at Ebbets Field, to commemorate the 60th anniversary of the demolition of Ebbets Field in 1960. Thank you, and good night.
Thanks. Hello.
The proceeding has been a Comfortably Zoned network production. You are advised to keep your dreams wet, your humor dry, your children and grandchildren out of military recruiting offices and off the laps of clerics who wear dresses. Thank you for listening, everyone. Happy trails.